India is one of those countries that had a nuclear power program for a very long time. The Atomic Energy Commission was set up actually in 1948, a few months after India won independence. Ever since then, it has had, so the nuclear power program was set up on, the initial charge of it was to use atomic energy for peaceful purposes. And then eventually over a period of time it acquired nuclear weapons dimension, which I'm not going to talk about here, but it's sort of put out there. But ever since then, the main rationale for their existence, as it were, was to generate electricity for development. And the assumption was that India would have very fast growing energy needs, and so at some point you run out of all other possibilities, coal and water, hydro and so on and so forth, and nuclear will be the only possibility. So the person who found it was a chap called Homi Bhabha. He was not to be confused with the guy who sits in Harvard now, but he was a physicist trained in Cambridge. And he went back to India at some point, and around the time of when a lot of atomic energy programs were being set up around the world, he also started one there. And Bhabha's basic premise was that, it was exactly the same argument that I said. India would run out of power, so we have to generate nuclear power. That's the only way we can do it. And so he kind of envisioned that by the next few decades, nuclear power would become the most dominant thing. This was in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So by 1954, they produced the first of their big projections about how much nuclear power was going to be produced. Oh, sorry.
Don't go too far.
I have
back.
a habit of moving around.
So don't go too far back. You are out of the frame.
No, I'm offside. I'm
Now,
okay.
now we are okay.
Okay, good. All right. I will try to. So the first of their big projections was that by the year 1980, you would have about 8,000 megawatts of nuclear power, going up to 25,000 by the time it is the late 1980s. And then by the end of the 1960s, these initial projections were being produced when there was not a single watt of nuclear electricity being produced in the country. So it was all completely paper projections. Right? By the time they were setting up their first nuclear power plant in Tarapur in western Maharashtra, they were sort of talking about 43,000 megawatts by the year 2000. And the general assumption was, I think Bhabha said it this way, by the end of the century, nuclear power will be the dominant source of power in India, and after that point, it will all essentially be only nuclear power. So this was the kind of expectation. And in comparison to that right now, what the current amount that's there is about 4.78 gigawatts, 4,780 megawatts. It's mostly heavy water reactors, which are reactors which were imported from Canada and then indigenized in some fashion. So the first reactors were set up in Rajasthan, and subsequently they have been sort of modified when they were set up in Madras, in Kalpakkam, in Narora, in Kakrapar, in Gujarat, and so on and so forth. And they also had imported two light water, boiling water reactors in this place called Tarapur, which I just mentioned. That's in western Maharashtra between Bombay and Gujarat on the coast. And the Tarapur reactors are essentially the same design as what was at Fukushima. They were boiling water reactors with the Mark I containment design. Anyway, India also has a sort of fast breeder reactor program. I'll talk about that. They have a small pilot scale fast breeder reactor. It's been operating since 1985. And then it's roughly about twice one more time what they have right now is under construction. Most of them again are heavy water reactors, but there are these two pressurized water reactors, light water reactors of the so-called BVR 1000 design that are being imported from Russia. Those are the ones which are being constructed in Koodankulam. And there's also one fast breeder reactor under construction. In terms of what India has, nuclear power contributes about 2.3% of the installed electricity capacity in the country. The bulk of the capacity is coal, about 57% as you can see. There's some amount of gas which is growing, and there's a substantial amount of hydro, which are large dams primarily. The next biggest component, I guess, is actually renewables. There's a sort of catch-all thing which includes wind, solar, and so on. Bulk of it is probably wind at this point. and some small hydros, some biomass-based things. So that's all. If you look at the sort of different components, the fast-moving, fast-growing sectors essentially are the renewables and the coal. That's because it just takes much lesser time to sort of set up a windmill or a photovoltaic thing. If you look at the actual amount of electricity produced, obviously it will be slightly different. So typically coal and nuclear and so on are run and what are called base load capacity, which means that they don't go up and down in their capacity. Whereas wind and solar, of course, you have to do it when the wind is blowing, when the sun is shining. And hydro is something which is used to often fill in sort of the gaps. So you have, typically our demand pattern goes up and down. During the day you use a little bit more, during the morning more, during the afternoon a little bit less, then the using again goes up. So to adjust for those kinds of things, you use either oil or gas or hydro typically. So as I said, from the very beginning, the nuclear establishment in India has projected huge amounts of nuclear power sometime in the future. And so this has not changed. This is a characteristic that sort of persisted. And they've always come short, but they have not sort of come short of producing newer projections. So their new projection is that they would grow by roughly more than 100-fold by 2050. So the next 4 decades essentially. And so this is sort of a projection. I sort of won't go into this, but the only thing which I would want to mention is that most of their projections are based on, if you look at the top, the brownish thing and the kind of the pink one, these two things, they are all sort of what are called breeder reactors, which are reactors which are supposedly produce more fuel than you put into it. They have special problems with it. This is not a talk about that, so I won't talk about it, but that's going to be sort of the big thing. And I just want to say that these are reactor types that have been conceived of in many different countries. Many countries sort of base their programs originally on the expectation there will be lots of breeder reactors, including the United States, including the United Kingdom, Japan, Russia, France, and so on. Most of them have given up on this because there are sort of huge technical problems with it. There are also safety issues with it, and last but not least, they're very expensive. India is one of the few countries which sort of hold out on this, and then they also have these hopes of using thorium sometime in the far future. But it's not something which is going to materialize anytime soon. And for that very reason, as completely on technical grounds, you can kind of expect that they will fail to meet these targets, even if, regardless of your position on nuclear power.
So what's the reason for India holding on?
Why are they holding on to it? That's a very complicated question. I would say there are sort of 3 reasons. One is, the expectation was that the nuclear power program was not just going to produce lots of electricity, but also it had to be indigenous, right? And so you could not be seen to import large amounts of stuff which you require for those things. And this was part of, I think, the whole post-colonial thing about, when you're setting it up in the 40s and 50s, you wanted to be seen as being indigenous. So India, for better or for worse, has fairly limited amounts of good quality uranium ores. Uranium is very ubiquitous. You can find it anywhere you go out in the soil here, you dig it, you'll find some uranium there. But it's often to try and extract out good usable uranium from that, you'll have to process large amounts of material. So then that makes it very expensive. So it's not something which is economically mineable from everywhere. So if you think about economically mineable source of uranium, India has fairly limited amounts. Because of that, it's something which is seen as we need to be able to generate it using our own uranium, and therefore these reactors which can actually use the leftover plutonium that's produced in the reactor and so on were attractive. So when you could project, therefore saying based purely on Indian uranium, we will use it in both regular kind of reactors and these breeder reactors. The breeder reactors produce more fuel, therefore we can actually in principle envision a large growth. Now the next question therefore is, okay, so that was then, why now, right? And so one answer I would say is that this shows in some sense an organizational inability to learn. That you see failures and you still keep saying it's going to happen, right?
Sort of like a religion.
Kind of. And so the religion aspect of it is also true. The religion aspect of it is that's going to be my third reason, was that Bhabha said it, right? And he is our founder. So if he has said that we are going to have breeder reactors and thorium, how can we, his descendants, kind of go against from that? So that's the religion aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is, someday, we are smart, we will figure out if other countries can't do it, so what, we can do it. So, that's, I think, part of the whole thing. I mean, here, now that I'm in Silicon Valley, I can sort of say this. Also, I think in the 90s, there used to be a joke about how germanium is supposed to be the material that's supposed to be very attractive, but at some point everybody was saying the whole electronics industry will switch to germanium, and then by the 90s there was this joke about saying germanium is the material of the future, always has been, always will be, and so breeder reactors are like that for nuclear power, and thorium is also like that. It's just even further out. All right. Coming back, so the fact that they have failed in these producing things, the one thing which you can't really use as a reason for why they have not is government support. The government is always, all governments have supported them consistently. From the very beginning, they have never been denied, and I can sort of show you slides of how much budgets they have got and so on. They've always been given ample amount of budgets. So in some sense, if they've not delivered, it's not because of lack of government support. And a convincing sort of example of that was in the wake of Fukushima. Many countries were sort of reconsidering, right? Most of them sort of did stick with nuclear power, including the United States and so on. India was among the same set of countries. But India was one of the first countries after Fukushima to give an okay to a new set of reactors. These are the reactors to be constructed in Jaitapur in Maharashtra. So, and coincidentally, it happened on Chernobyl Day, 25 years later. So that was the day they chose to announce they were going to build the Jaitapur reactors. This, I think, it's a sort of symbolic example of how committed the government is to nuclear power, for better or for worse. Very briefly, I'll say one more thing. I'm not going to sort of talk about the organizational structure of the nuclear power establishment. I'm going to use this term nuclear power and BAE and so on, sort of interchangeably without being necessarily precise. But just to say that one aspect of it which is important is that all the safety activities of it, but let me just back up. So the all nuclear power policy is set by something called the Atomic Energy Commission. The Atomic Energy Commission is mostly sort of nuclear scientists, but also some people from the bureaucracy, from the IAS kind of cadre and so on. The actual implementation of everything is carried on by something called by the Department of Atomic Energy, which is a scientific department in the government. And the secretary of this thing is like a cabinet level secretary person. And then in turn, the DAE has set up a bunch of sort of organizations under it, including some industrial organizations and the Nuclear Power Corporation and so on, so public sector undertakings. Those are the ones who actually run the reactors, produce the heavy water that's being used, things of that sort. All safety is managed by something called the Atomic Energy Regulatory Board. Since its inception, the head of the AERB answers to the Atomic Energy Commission. So it comes under the Atomic Energy Commission. Now, by the way it is set up by law, the head of the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission is always the secretary of the Department of Atomic Energy. So in some sense, what AERB is doing is sort of regulating its boss's concerns, so to say. So there's obviously a conflict of interest there. Now, since Fukushima, one of the things that the government has done is to say, we're going to change the structure, but I think the changes really don't go far enough, but that's another topic for another day. Okay, so Koodankulam, as you all know, there's something been in the news. Let me just start by sort of talking about what the most recent sort of things are. The reactor is sort of nearly complete. This is not the most recent picture. It's one of the only good quality pictures I had of the reactor from a relatively closer distance. The last news that we have is that it's going to commence power in January, the first of the units. That's what they say. Now, they said this kind of stuff before and it has not happened, so we don't know whether it actually happened in January. But nevertheless, that's sort of the expectation. The activists who are sort of working around Koodankulam, and I'll talk much more about them, have been trying to still do various things. So the latest was, I think, on December 11th, on World Human Rights Day, they decided to sort of lay siege to the plant. As a result of which we had the Russian envoy basically saying there's all sort of gimmicks and games, and it's all foreign funded and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, fun and games. All right, so let me just start by saying something a little bit about Koodankulam. So Koodankulam is sort of down here. It's in the extreme southern part of India, very close to Sri Lanka. It's near Kanyakumari, the sort of tip of the country. It was a site that was originally chosen in the 1980s as sort of various, the Department of Atomic Energy at various points have gone through these site selection exercises. So the first set of exercises produced Tarapur, produced Kalpakam in Madras, produced Narora in northern in UP and so on and so forth. In the second round produced Kaiga and Kakrapar and so on. I think in the third round they chose Koodankulam as one of the sites. It lost out to Kaiga originally when they chose to build that reactor there. But then in the 80s, for a variety of reasons, India decided to import a set of reactors from the Soviet Union at that time, which is called the Soviet Union. The roots of it have to go to two things. First was that in 1974, India conducted its first nuclear weapons test, as a result of which India was proscribed. I mean, many countries sort of ganged up and said, we are not going to sell you any more nuclear technology because you imported this reactor from Canada ostensibly for peaceful uses, and you conducted this nuclear test. Of course, the Indians kind of said, well, this was, we call it a peaceful nuclear explosion. It was completely peaceful in its purposes, and nobody else sort of bought that argument. So most people sort of started this trade cartel, essentially, which eventually became a nuclear suppliers group. So for a very long time, India was trying to sort of break that. And the Soviet Union was kind of, it was a partner with India and so on and so forth, but they never sold a reactor to India. 1986, Chernobyl happens, right? So basically the Soviet nuclear industry was in really bad shape. And they were, they had a huge image loss in a sense. And so they at that point basically turned around and said, okay, we will export a reactor to you. You guys have been wanting one, we'll export one to you. I'm sort of simplifying a complicated story, but I think that's roughly the general picture. And so India, for its own reasons, wanted a reactor to be able to import a foreign reactor. One of the reasons was that they were not able to meet targets and so on and so forth. And so there was a sort of confluence of interest there. So in the 80s, they sort of basically decided that. And in 1988, I think there was a intergovernmental accord between Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and at that time Mikhail Gorbachev to import two VVR-1000 reactors. So VVR-1000 reactors are what are called light water reactors, which means they use water to both slow down neutrons and to take the heat from the nuclear fission to convert it into to send it to the steam generators to produce steam, which will then produce
coolant and moderator.
Coolant and moderator. It's water, right? This is unlike the Chernobyl design, which is actually it has graphite carbon basically, which is using the moderation. So it's a slightly different design. The project essentially at that time.
One quick question:
Sure.
these power plants, do they recycle water, or do they just dump it? Whatever the one, not the one that they have in the reactor, but the one with which they run the steam engine, the steam turbine.
Yeah, the waste heat is dumped into the water, into the sea.
Into the sea.
Yeah.
And the source of the water is.
So there are fresh water and salt water. The salt water is basically used for the secondary cooling.
Okay.
The other water is a more complicated story. They originally envisioned, for this particular reactor, they envisioned bringing it from a lake called Pechipare, which is about 60 kilometers away, if I'm not mistaken. And they were going to build a long canal and so on. And one of the first, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, one of the big sources of sort of objection was that farmers were objecting to this water being diverted for this purpose. And so at some point, in the mid-2000s, as part of their attempt to try and, sort of take away some of these points of contention, they said we are going to build a reverse osmosis plant on site, which will take seawater and produce fresh water from it. So that's very good.
And would you also be talking about potential contamination at all these barriers, boundaries between?
Let's talk about it at the end. Yeah, it's not part of the talk.
Okay.
All right. I'm going slower than I can imagine, so then I should probably cut out even stuff that I've already put in. So I will not add things on during the talk. Okay. So the project was frozen after the Soviet Union broke up. And so for a while it sort of went away to oblivion and then kind of revived in 1998. And again, there was a kind of confluence of interest. In 1998, India had just tested nuclear weapons and sort of a fresh round of sort of sanctions and so on. And the Russia's part, the Russian economy was in really bad shape. At that point, they were not able to sort of pay their nuclear workers and so on. So again, there's sort of interest in both sides to revive the whole deal. And so that's when the deal got sort of revived. and the construction started in 2001. Originally, the plants were supposed to be commissioned in 2007 and 2008. So it's about 5 years delayed at this point. The opposition to the plant also started around the same time. I didn't have time to change this, but at lunch we had somebody who had come, Koodankulam, who told me that he had actually participated in a signature campaign in 1987 against the plant. So I sort of stand corrected that it actually starts from even before that. But anyway, the opposition to the plant started almost immediately as soon as the details were known. And in December 1988, there was a big rally in Tirunelveli, in the town of Tirunelveli there. And in 1989, for May Day, there was a huge demonstration, and especially the fish workers union were sort of very, very involved in that. And so some of you probably know that the fish workers have been, since the 80s, they've been really very active on Tom Kocheri and people like that. So their main concern has been this question of sort of hot water basically coming into the sea. And they've found that, the 80s also was a period when sort of the trawlers were coming in and so on, so their livelihoods were being affected by a number of different sources, and this was one more thing. So they've been, in fact, even now, they've been one of the main backbones of the movement, the fishing people there. So they organized a huge demonstration, with apparently over 10,000 people came, and then the police resorted to firing. And it's not very clear it's true or not, but there's some reports that one person died in the firing then and so on and so forth. But soon after that was when the Soviet Union collapsed, so then the movement sort of went into dormancy. And then again in around 2001, when the construction started, was when the movement started picking up steam again. And one of the people who has been very involved in this, whose face must be familiar to most of you now, is a chap called SP Uday Kumar. Uday used to be, he did his PhD from University of Hawaii, and then he was in Minnesota when some of us knew him. And around that time he went back to India, and he and his partner Meera, they started a little school there in Nagarkoil. And he started doing this kind of stuff, and he and his good friends would literally sort of go around from village to village, sort of talking about nuclear power and so on and so forth. And with the result that he has a large population of people who sort of are familiar with this issue.
What was the demand in 89?
To scrap the project.
That's
it. Sorry, it's all just to say, we don't want this project. So anyway, so from 2001, essentially, the opposition has been trying to do various things. They would periodically hold, hunger strikes in front of the collector's office, try to submit memoranda to, various state officials, and all the usual sort of panoply of things that, social movements in India sort of resort to. Yes?
So these are fish workers and farmers.
And farmers, generally the local inhabitants, so the whole bunch of villages around there. Some of them were concerned about being eventually asked to vacate from there, but most of them were really concerned about the fact that two things. One was, they'd all heard about Chernobyl, right? That's how the movement originally started. So concern about accidents has been there, a persistent thing. But for some groups, it was a real livelihood issue, which is sort of also propelling the movement. The first time that actually this movement had an option to actually exercise their voice, in a sense, in an official setting, was at the public hearing for the environmental impact assessment. So all projects in India which are worth 100 crores or more, which are expected to have some kind of environmental impact, have under law supposed to get an environmental impact assessment done. Now this law was first passed in 1994. So the first two reactors, Koodankulam 1 and 2, which are being constructed, did not have to go through a public hearing process. They did an environmental impact assessment. It was kept secret, essentially. It was not shared with the public. And then before the first reactors were commissioned, India was sort of already talking with the Soviet Union about building number 3 and number 4 on the same site. And so when they were doing that, they had to go through this process of, yes.
So 1 and 2 are the picture that you showed us, was that one?
That's 1 or 2, I don't know. Yeah.
So that's the one that's supposed to start working in January?
Yes. Yeah, so I must also say, since you brought it up, so whether 3 or 4 are going to happen or not at this point is actually a little confusing, it's not clear because of this whole liability issue, and we'll talk about that later if you want.
So this hearing was for 3
for
and
3
4?
and 4,
Okay.
yes. So they put out this public hearing, this public version of the environmental impact assessment, and in 2007 they organized the hearing for that. So the hearing is supposed to be where public are supposed to come and say what their views of the project are. And it's conducted by the local administration. So in this case it was the district collector who conducted it. And so the setting was that it was in the engineering college in Tirunelveli. And I had gone there, so I can sort of, that's why we're talking about this a little bit. It was, the hall had about 800 people. It could sort of seat about 800 people. And there were about 7,000 people who had come from all the sort of 3 districts. And so the vast majority of them sat outside. There were some pandals created there, and then the other people, so a few people were selected to come in. And there was complete sort of overwhelming opposition. Everybody was, you can see in the picture, they're all saying, Vendam, this is what kind of thing they're sort of talking about, right? The hearing sort of lasted maybe about 2 hours, 10 o'clock to about noon or something. And various people were saying, what are you going to do with the waste, what are you going to do with the blah blah. And the setting of the hearing itself is very interesting, because what happens is the district collector sits, and then on one side of the, so there's a raised stage, and on that stage basically Nuclear Power Corporation comes to come and talk. And these guys are supposed to be sort of listening. So it's not, the setting is not one of saying the public has to say what it wants to say and be done. So the hearing is like somebody like me would sort of stand and they'll put up these impressive looking sort of pictures and all kinds of 4 levels of safety, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. And so it's this, the setting is not one where actually these guys have to listen. In this particular, and I've seen this in other places, but here what is interesting was that the opposition was so strong, these guys couldn't go through their presentation. The first slide they put up, they said, no, we don't want your presentation, sorry. You're not supposed to be allowed to do this here, blah, blah, blah. And so the dynamic was very different. But the interesting thing was the end of it, the other thing under law is that the minutes of the meeting are supposed to be made on the spot, read out to the public, they're supposed to accept it, and then the minutes are supposed to be sent to the the Minister of Environment and Forests, which is supposed to look at those minutes and say whether these are actually whether this is a project, what is the public's opinion on this. Basically what the collector said at the end of, at 12 o'clock was, we have done, the Nuclear Power Corporation, I thank them for answering all the doubts of you people, thank you very much for coming, that's it. And if you go and read the minutes, that's essentially what it says. The minute says that the Nuclear Power Corporation addressed all the questions that the public audience had, and end of the story. And then anyway, so the project got environmental approval. But what I want to mention about is that the one occasion when actually people have had a chance to voice their opinion, they've actually voiced it very clearly. And yeah.
So you said you were there at this?
Yes, I was. Yes.
In what?
In what capacity? Yeah. I was actually asked by an environmental NGO to try and look at the the environmental impact assessment. I sort of work on nuclear power issues. I'm a physicist originally by training, and I've been sort of doing that kind of stuff. So I had actually submitted a critique, so to say, of this thing. What are the problems? The problems essentially were that it's a very standard document. There are a bunch of boxes they have to check. So there's a social impact assessment. So they will talk about how many jobs it's going to create. And there's a so the environmental impact, the primary environmental impact they spend a lot of time talking about is how much dust will there be in the air, and they measure various things. So stuff of that sort. It looks very impressive, but if you actually sort of know something about what's happening, they won't talk about it. So one of the main problems is that the thing which we are most concerned about is sort of something to do with radioactive stuff, because the nuclear reactor produces radioactive stuff, right? And any measurement of radiation is done by the Baba Atomic Research Center, part of the Department of Atomic Energy. So in some sense, it's all, so they control the most important parts of the environmental impact assessment. They do the assessment, they do the measurement, they produce the results, they publish it in whatever fashion they want. So, yeah. Go ahead.
So is there any other agency in India or independent, I don't know, agency or watchdog who is capable of doing these measurements?
Very difficult. For one thing, you don't have access to those sites, so you have to be sufficiently close by to be able to measure that. I mean, there are a few independent Geiger counters and so on. So in principle, like many things in India, so the law is very restrictive. They can actually say you cannot have these things, you cannot do certain things. On the other hand, it's not actually implemented, it's not actually done. So if you had a Geiger counter, nobody's going to come and arrest you. Unless they decide that for some reason you're a troublemaker, then they can use that provision of the law to come and arrest you. So most of the time they don't bother with it. It's more trouble for them than, people like me writing or somebody else doing some measurements. It doesn't matter to them.
Just a quick note, Ramana. So of all the so many reactors in India we have, right? I know that there are rules that something like within 5 kilometers or 3 kilometers there should be nobody living, and all these regulations are there in law. Can you, not just in Koodankulam, can you just say a word on how are these actually being followed in any of these sites?
Yeah. So there are sort of 3 zones. I mean, the primary zones, 2 zones are, there's 1.6 kilometers what's called the exclusion zone. 1.6 kilometers is actually 1 mile. It's just a round number, and they kind of said at that distance is where nobody should be allowed to live inside that. So that's the cordoned off area. Then up to 5 kilometers from the plant is the region where they want no influx, essentially. So it has to be, the population has to grow due to natural sort of things. They don't want to tell everybody to go away from that area, because that actually means that some substantial number of people have to be pushed out. But they are not allowed to, people are not supposed to allow to be coming in and settling, in principle. Now the problem with site selection is, and then they also want to say, further out that you should be X number of kilometers, I forget the exact number, say like 10 or 25, from towns of which have more than 10,000 people and 100,000 people and stuff like that. But the problem with site selection essentially has been that you have a bunch of criteria, right? So you want to think about availability of water, right? They all require water for cooling. You want low population zones so that you don't have to displace a large number of people. But at the same time, you also want to be near demand centers, because you don't want to be sort of shipping electricity for a very, very long distance. So these are sometimes in conflict with each other. And typically, I think many of these other conveniences sort of win over. They don't keep it near very large cities, but over a period of time things expand and so on and so forth. So these things get violated. The movement sort of continued, over the environmental impacts when everything sort of went on, and essentially took a turning point in after March 11th, 2011, when the Fukushima reactors, the accident started. And this was in some sense the first televised nuclear accident, right? So it was seen all over the world, and saw these signs of these things sort of blowing up and things like that. So in a sense, what happened was, for the people of the region who had been hearing PMAIN, the group, People's Movement Against Nuclear Energy and so on, talk about it, this was visual proof, right? So in some sense, all the stuff that the establishment can say about how reactors are safe sort of exploded in this moment. So it really changed the way they sort of did that, and so you had a huge amount of sort of the movement galvanized itself after that. So huge numbers of people sort of walking on, around the towns, in the huge gatherings and stuff like that. And essentially by August, things became even worse, because the plant, the nuclear power corporation, was just going on as though nothing happened in Fukushima, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, what their reactions were. But they sort of, at this point, the people basically said, I think in July was when they were doing some dry run. And there was there were a couple of things which happened. One was, there was some loud sound which came out of there, and people really got sort of scared about that. And there's also one case when they had to do as part of emergency planning, there are drills which have to be gone through. And so they went through one of those drills, and people were told, you're supposed to sort of hold a kerchief over your nose and sort of walk away from here or something like that. And so all those things sort of conspired to make people really, really afraid, right? So they were really worried at this point. And so by sort of September, October, they basically said, we're going to sort of get out of the plant. And the staff members were supposed to be working on sort of completing the plant, couldn't go in. So you had a huge number of people sort of actually move back to wherever they'd come from. A lot of the labor comes from migrant, they moved from one plant to the other. So many of them had to sort of went back to where they were coming from. People refused to allow them to come and live in those houses, buy stuff and so on and so forth. It was a real social boycott in a sense. And and then this scene about how they sort of try to do blockading from the sea and so on. So it's very creative the way actually the movement has sort of gone about it. They've not had spectacular success in terms of sort of getting government support, but I'll sort of talk about that in a second. But nevertheless, I think they've sort of adopted a whole bunch of very creative things which they sort of, I think is worth pointing out. And they've sort of received solidarity messages from various people around the world, including our own Noam Chomsky, and a whole bunch of people. So I'm happy to give these slides, so if you want to read those things, you can do that later on. But coming back to sort of the more important thing is the political response. And so I think what's interesting was, the Jayalalitha initially sort of said that, we are going to be supporting you on this plan. And she actually went back and said, you cannot start this plant against the wishes of these people until they sort of accept this risk. We are not going to we're not going to push for it. And this happened in basically the local elections, which happened in March of 2012. And so till that point, she was kind of, initially she came out very strongly, then she was a huge amount of backlash against her, both from the center. Manmohan Singh sort of, Narayan Swamy came from the Prime Minister's office, came several times, trying to basically persuade her, no, you have to go through with the project and so on. And then I think the center has done various other things in various ways. There was also sort of some amount of backlash from within Tamil Nadu. The DMK, of course, used this as an opportunity to say, no, this is Jayalalitha sort of creating a scare when there's no reason to be afraid of this reactor. Also saying, she's the cause for our power problems, electricity shortages in Tamil Nadu, which, as some of you know, has been very intense, very problematic for a variety of reasons. So anyway, so there was a huge amount of backlash. And eventually she waited sort of till the local elections. And then in March, the moment the elections came out and she won, she switched. And she said, go ahead with the thing. And the way she did the switch was also interesting. Was that what she basically did was, is the way they sort of, do these things in a way that doesn't sort of wipes their hands clean in a way, which is to set up an expert committee. And if you look at the composition of the expert committee, the guy who's actually handing over the report to the expert committee, the report is a chap called M.R. Srinivasan, who used to be the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission in the late 1980s. So, once you put him on that commission and you bunch of other people who know what their views are on that thing, you know what report they're going to produce. And they produce a report basically saying this plant is safe. Go ahead and commission it. And so she did that. And then simultaneously, the police were sort of really told to crack down. So they have put all kinds of cases, apparently about over 5,000 cases on. Some people have, like Uday has about 73 cases against him. Basically means that the rest of his life, even if nothing happens, he's going to be running from court to police station to whatever, two kinds of things, if he ever sort of came out of where he is right now. And including case of sedition, all these people who came out in those boats, they were all charged with sedition, which is, I suppose, one of the worst sort of crimes. Of course, Gandhi was charged under the British. Anyway, so that basically, and then right now, essentially, as I mentioned earlier, the plant commissioning activities are going on, and probably by next month, the first of the plants will be sort of commissioned. And the people who are spearheading the movement, the people's movement against nuclear energy, primarily Uday Kumar, Pushparayan, and Siva Subramaniam, they are all sort of holed up in one village called Idindakarai. And the people have basically sort of formed a little group around them, several thousand people, who basically say the police can't come inside this village. And the police are standing outside the village saying nobody can come out of the village. So it's kind of a little thing, and this is the way I understand it. I haven't visited there, and I've sort of not contacted them for a very, really long time. I mean, though I know Uday and so on, ever since this thing started, I sort of kept off it, primarily because there was this whole, in the middle thing which I didn't talk about, the whole notion of foreign hand and what's the role of the foreigners and so on and so forth. So at least I didn't want to contribute my little foreign hand to that. Having done it in the past. Okay, let me now go quickly to sort of talk a little bit about whether there is some justification to this worry. And so I'll sort of talk about this in two levels. So first I'll talk a little bit about what are the problems with nuclear reactors and why this is something which people should be concerned about. And as you all know, sort of nuclear power is sort of unique in that it's capable of massive accidents, catastrophic accidents, which can create which is spread out, damage which is spread out both in space and time. And I guess the best example of that is Chernobyl. As you know, so large parts of Belarus and Ukraine and Russia and so on were contaminated by that accident in 1986. And approximately about 3,000 square kilometers is still officially evacuated because it's contaminated with this long-lived radionuclide called cesium-137. So it's all over the soil and so on. It's a gamma emitter, so you can't, if you walk around there, you basically get a radiation dose. So once the dose is sufficiently high, they basically said nobody should be in those regions. And there's a much even larger area where you cannot eat the food that is grown there and stuff of that sort. And there are, at least about 1,800 plus cases of thyroid cancer, and it's said to be the largest number of cancers of one type caused by a single event on one date. And this is from the United Nations, not from some sort of anti-nuclear organization. If you look at Greenpeace or something, they sort of have much larger figures. There's one, so the debate about the number of deaths is a very complicated one. I won't talk about it, except to say that typically the nuclear establishment has kind of underestimated it, as you can imagine, and people on the other side have overestimated it. So the range is from about, I think the official number is about 4,000 from the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, and about 1 million from a bunch of doctors who have sort of looked at some of the records in the Slavic journals and so on, and they sort of simply talk past each other. If you sort of look at what estimates there are of the amount of radiation that was released and what must have sort of been settled in various places and how much people will be exposed to, you probably get to about, my own estimate is about 34,000, give or take 10,000. These are very uncertain numbers, but it's in the tens of thousands is probably what is the best you can say at this point. The other thing which is interesting is that if you look at the sort of geographical distribution of it, the primary impact of it is local, even though the impacts do globally. The people who are most affected are people who live in the sort of not far vicinity from that particular facility. There are also a whole range of what are called stigmatization, right? Which is that even though they may not be actually affected, people from those regions are seen as carrying something. So from Fukushima also you hear this, kids who go to some other school, other kids don't want to talk to them or sit next to them, stuff of that sort. These are sort of social effects in a sense, whether they're justified or not, they're real, they are there. So it's something which people are sort of concerned about. Anyway, coming back to sort of the question of nuclear reactors, so the problem is that these are very complex technologies, right? There are all kinds of things that are going on. They have huge amounts of radioactive materials, they are high pressure, high temperature, and things which can actually operate very, very fast. And so, the way they typically try to say is you have multiple systems which, are trying to make it safe, and you have some amount of redundancy. So hopefully, the net effect is that the probability is going to be very small of an accident. And I won't talk about this in great detail, but the result of it, this is basically that people who are designing nuclear reactors are extremely confident that they are safe. And you see this in all countries. Right? When the people who are designing the reactors are very confident that no accidents will ever happen. Right? And I love this quote from somebody from the Soviet, then Soviet Union, member of the International Atomic Energy Agency, who basically said the serious loss of coolant accident is practically impossible in a Soviet reactor. And what is important was that he's actually correct. The reason he was correct was that he was actually looking at, and he was looking at some particular design element of the RBMK reactor, which is in Chernobyl, and he was basically reacting to the 1979 accident in 3 Mile Island. And that particular type of accident is not possible in a Chernobyl type reactor, for this reason that he mentioned. So he's technically correct. What he is not correct about is that other kinds of accidents are possible. And this sort of bottom line is that these reactors are so complicated and there are so many different ways in which they can actually have an accident that if you know about some ways, you can try to protect against them. But if there are unknown ways through which your accident happens, you don't know how to protect against them. So that's actually the basic problem. And of course you have these events that happen. I won't sort of talk about this. Let me just go on to quickly just say a couple of things. So this is something, what I said very crudely about the fact that there are multiple ways of things which can go wrong, is something which has been very well studied by people who are not engineers, who don't design reactors. What they do is actually study accidents. So why do accidents happen? And for them, in that sense, a nuclear reactor accident is no different from the accident that happens in, let's say, a petrochemical plant, about the Gulf oil blowout and stuff of that sort. They look at why these accidents happen, and they look at it from 2 lenses. One is from the sort of technology lens, right? What went wrong in the technology? And I could sort of talk a little bit about what happened in Fukushima and how that happened, but I'll sort of skip that in the interest of time. And there are other people who look at it from an organizational lens. I'll get back to that a little bit. But one of the best studies from a technology point of view is this chap called Charles Perrow, who was a sociologist in Yale, who wrote a very famous book in the early 1980s, 1984, called Normal Accidents. And they basically point out to 2 particular aspects of these kind of technologies which have accidents. One he called interactively complex. They're complex, but the different parts sort of interact with each other. So one thing. The other is what he says, the tightly coupled, that one failure quickly leads to another one. So the way to think about tightly coupled systems is, imagine that you're flying, right? And you're flying through some kind of, from here to India, let's say, and you have to change flights in Europe. Now, if your two flights are very close to each other in time, your connection in Germany, you have exactly half an hour, then in that little bit of time, anything that goes wrong, your lace comes off and you stop to sort of tie your lace or something, you can miss your connection. That kind of small things can actually trip up the system very easily when the system acts in very, very rapid motion, right? And then if you're interactively complexity, then various small things in different parts can sort of conspire with each other to produce a much larger failure. And the bottom line that conclusion that Perot came up with was a very pessimistic one. He said, you can do the best job you want, but given the nature of the technology, some number of accidents are inevitable. Right? He didn't say they were going to be frequent. He actually, if you look at his theory, though he himself may say the other things, nothing in the theory says it has to happen very frequently. Of course, the more number of reactors, the more accidents. That's a sort of obvious thing. But there's nothing which says that, but that you cannot rule out accidents is basically the bottom line. Now, how does sort of the nuclear establishment in India, and this is why I'm going to connect it back, sort of Koodankulam. So, how do these people sort of think about these accidents, right? So, if you look at how they reacted to Fukushima, I think it's a good example. So, you look at what various people said about Fukushima. So, this is the chairman of the Nuclear Power Corporation, the guy who runs all the nuclear reactors and who will run the Koodankulam plant when it is set up. He basically said there is no nuclear accident or incident in Japan's Fukushima plant. It was a well-planned emergency preparedness program, right? So essentially denial is the first response, right? The second was sort of trivialization, right? Saying, well, there was not much radiation, the number of people who have died due to accident is 0. If you look at all the earlier accidents also, it was very, very few. So 50 or 60 is the number they like to quote for Chernobyl. As I mentioned, at least even the International Atomic Energy uses a figure like 4,000. Right? So there's a kind of trivialization that happens. A third response is to say, don't worry, we can take care of it. Right? So they say, we are prepared to handle an event like Fukushima. And as a reality check, I offer this thing. A year before that, in 2010, there was a debate there was sort of about this so-called nuclear liability bill. For those of you who followed that, it was about how much compensation, what mechanisms of compensation for a nuclear accident. And as part of that, it went to a committee in Parliament, and they invited people from different agencies to sort of give their representation for this. And so the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare basically said, what is it talking about? We don't know how to deal with one of these things. We don't have the requisite number of radiation beds and blah, blah, blah. So essentially there is some reality check which doesn't add up. But the bottom line essentially is to say, a Fukushima-like disaster cannot happen in India. That's the basic thing they're interested in. For a number of reasons they would sort of argue about. You have repeated statements about how the reactor is 100% safe, the chances of an accident are 0 or 1 in infinity, as the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission said. And the other thing which, because the Fukushima accident was caused by a tsunami or was sort of triggered by a tsunami, they basically had to say, we know everything about tsunamis and earthquakes and so on, we've taken all of them into account, right? And again, as a reality check, I offer this quote from 1986, where they basically said in India, tsunamis don't occur. And of course, after 2004, they had to change that, so quickly they sort of changed that, but nevertheless, that's kind of the thing. Right? So the basic point is, I think again and again, different ways they kind of said, the chances of an accident are 0. Right? And this is not a new thing, they sort of said this all along. And I think this is something which, and this is not something which they say only as purely PR kind of stuff. And there's certainly a PR aspect to it. But I think very deep down also sort of think about it in this way. There's this confidence that somehow our reactors are so safe that nothing can happen, nothing can go wrong. And it's something the former chairperson basically said, people should be confident about safety if you want to operate it. And if you think about it, it actually makes sense. Right? If you have to go and work every day in one of these things and you keep thinking, oh my God, something can happen wrong, you can't work. So you have to ideologically persuade people somehow that nothing is going to go wrong. So there's actually some validity to this assumption that you have to be confident about safety. And so they are that, I think. And then you can ask the question, is this confidence justified? And you look at, there have been a series of accidents, and it is something which has gone wrong. I want to sort of talk about it. Just give you one little example. The example which I want to mention is that in 1993, there was a big fire that sort of came closest to a large radioactive release. And I want to sort of talk about the sort of what happened there, except to say there was a big fire there. And what is interesting for me is the fact that what happened there could have been completely avoided. Now the fire was triggered because one turbine blade broke off. Now a few months before that, a few years before that, the General Electric, which was the company that originally designed the turbines, had sent out an advisory saying, we have seen this problem, that after a little while, all these blades sort of break off, so you guys should all change it. Nuclear Power Corporation didn't do anything. The second problem was that the fire by itself was not a problem. The fire actually, what happened was it burnt out all the cables which run electricity to that. So control room was unusable, all kinds of safety systems were unusable. Now, this kind of fire actually happened in this country, in Alabama, in Browns Ferry in 1975. And as a result of it, in this country, for example, they basically made a rule which said all these cables that carry electricity should be laid in two separate things, and they should be in fire-resistant cables. Now, this is by the time the Ramana reactor came online, this is on standard practice everywhere around the world.
But they have backup power systems there, and control rooms?
They have backup power systems, but again, I think a lot of those things are also sort of burnt out in that particular case. So, as I said, the operators actually had to use flashlights to go in and sort of open up boron pipes and things like that. So, it was a very difficult, very close situation. So, if you look at sort of as I mentioned earlier on, there are also people who looked at accidents from the viewpoint of organizations, and they produce various sort of reasons for how organizations should be if they're dealing with this. And if you look at the kind of requirements that those theories sort of pose, you find that many of those things are being violated in the Nuclear Power Corporation. So in a sense, coming back to the question of Koodankulam, is their concern valid? And I would say the answer is yes. That there's some reason. It does not mean that tomorrow it's going to blow up. But the point is, should people be confident that an accident can never happen? And I think the answer is no to that. And to the extent that all reactors are susceptible to it, that's yes. And secondly, if you look at the way these people think about these accidents, an organization that's very confident that its facilities are safe is not one that you would want to trust on this particular question. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to sort of jump out. There's another long interlude which I won't talk about. And sort of conclude with saying, there are problems with the way the nuclear establishment in India has been living up to the risks of nuclear power accidents. And there are operational reasons to be concerned about the risk there. And it's very much out of touch with public perception, especially in these areas near nuclear reactors. You see this kind of protests in all the places which have been sort of identified. Ever since the 80s, essentially, the reactors were set up in Kaiga were the first ones which were hugely protested by the local public and so on and so forth. So I'll sort of stop there.